So you're here because you want to get your head around something complex,
Yeah.
right? Without, slogging through endless pages.
Yeah, get the real core insights, the stuff that actually sticks.
Exactly. And you're definitely in the right place. Today, we're diving deep into, well, a really fascinating and maybe surprisingly significant bit of American history. Jewish American organized crime.
It really is. It's a part of that whole American underworld story that often kind of flies under the radar. It gets overshadowed by other narratives. But as our sources show, it was actually a huge player for quite a long time.
Absolutely. And we've got some really interesting stuff here that lays out where it started, who the big names were, and, how it all changed over time.
Right.
So our mission today is basically to unpack all that, pull out those maybe unexpected connections and facts, so you really come away with a much clearer picture.
Okay.
Sounds good. Where we start?
Right. Let's start at the beginning. When and, how did this all actually take shape? Okay, so the story really kicks off with those big waves of Jewish immigration coming into the U.S. We're talking late 19th, early 20th centuries. And these new communities, they were often facing, real poverty, discrimination, opportunities were limited. And unfortunately, that environment allowed some criminal elements to develop within them.
And they picked up a few nicknames along the way, didn't they?
Yeah.
I saw Jewish mob, kosher mafia, even unser Stick.
Yeah.
What's the story there?
Yeah, exactly. Terms like Jewish mob, kosher mafia, they're pretty straightforward, right? Just identifying the ethnicity.
Right.
Sometimes that kosher bit had a sort of dark irony to it, given Jewish dietary laws,
Yeah, I can imagine.
But unser Stick, that one's really interesting. It's Yiddish. It means our thing.
Our thing.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is that linguistically, it's what they call a calque. It's borrowed directly from another language, translated word for word, from the Italian mafia's Cosa Nostra, which also means our thing.
Wow. So unser Stick directly mirrors Cosa Nostra.
Exactly. It suggests they were very aware of the Italian structure, maybe even, aspiring to that kind of organization.
That's incredible. That direct link in the name.
Yeah.
It really speaks volumes, doesn't it? About how they saw themselves or wanted to be seen.
It does.
Okay, so who were some of the first gangs and big figures to pop up?
So early on, late 19th, early 20th century, New York City is really the hot spot. You had Monk Eastman and his Eastman gang.
Monk Eastman, okay.
Now, interestingly, Eastman himself probably wasn't Jewish, but his gang, mostly Jewish guys, and they were a major force, clashing with Irish and Italian crews.
Right.
Then there was the Lenox Avenue gang. Harry Gyp the Blood Horowitz was the leader there.
Gyp the Blood, not subtle names.
Not at all. And they were known for being incredibly violent. Also a mix, actually Jewish and Italian members. They got really infamous for their part in murdering a gambler named Herman Rosenthal. That put them on the map big time.
Okay, and then Arnold Rothstein enters the picture in the 1920s. He sounds like a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. Rothstein in the Roaring Twenties, he totally transformed the landscape of organized crime. He wasn't just a thug, he was thinking bigger.
How so?
Well, he controlled a massive portfolio of illegal stuff, bootlegging huge during Prohibition, obviously loan sharking, gambling, bookmaking, you name it. But he ran it like a business, a strategist. There's a crime writer, Leo Katcher, who said Rothstein transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business run like a corporation with himself at the top.
Wow. Run like a corporation. That's a huge shift. He wasn't just thinking about street corners.
Not at all. He was thinking about structure, profit, influence.
And wasn't he the guy supposedly behind fixing the 1919 World Series? The Black Sox scandal?
That's the allegation, yeah. Whether he orchestrated the whole thing or just bankrolled it, he was definitely involved. It just shows the kind of reach he had, even back then.
Incredible. And it wasn't just New York, right? Our sources mentioned Detroit.
Yeah, Detroit during Prohibition was largely dominated by Jewish figures. And back in New York, even before Lansky and Siegel became, Lansky and Siegel, they had the Bugs and Meyer mob down in the Lower East Side. That was sort of their training ground before the bigger leagues.
Which brings us right into the Prohibition era and this intertwining with the Italian-American Mafia. How did those connections really get going?
Prohibition, yeah. 1920 to 33, it just blew the doors open for illegal money-making. Bootlegging alcohol was unbelievably profitable.
Right. A massive new market overnight.
Exactly. And Jewish organized crime figures were right there, ready to jump in. This is when you see the real rise of guys like Meyer, Lansky, Bugsy, Siegel,
The big name.
the really big names. Dutch Schultz, Mo Dalitz, Kid Can up in Minneapolis, Charles King Solomon in Boston, Abner Longies Willman over in New Jersey. And you can't forget Abe Bernstein and the Purple Gang in Detroit. They were notorious.
The Purple Gang, right.
Mhm.
And it was during this time that the connections with the Italian-American groups got really tight, wasn't it?
Yeah. Precisely. It moved beyond just street-level rivalry. Take the gang known as Murder Incorporated.
Ah, yes. Murder, Inc. Sounds pleasant.
Hey, right. They were basically the enforcement arm for the syndicate, and they were largely made up of Jewish and Italian-American hitmen working together. It shows that level of cooperation.
So figures like Lansky and Siegel, they weren't just running their own crews. They were actually influential within the Italian mafia structure, too.
Hugely influential, Lansky especially. He was the brains, the financial wizard. He and Lucky Luciano, the Italian boss, were key figures in forging this alliance. They basically convinced other Jewish and Italian mobsters that working together, forming this national crime syndicate, as the papers called it, was way better for business than fighting each other.
Yeah, there's that quote, isn't there? Something Siegel supposedly said.
Yeah, the source material mentions a report of Siegel saying something like, the Yids and the Dagos will no longer fight each other.
Crude, but gets the point across.
Exactly. Whether those were his exact words or not, it captures the shift. They realized cooperation meant bigger profits, less bloodshed between them anyway.
And they actually helped each other out in internal conflicts, too.
Yeah, good example is the Castellamarese War, that big internal power struggle within the New York Italian Mafia in the early 30s. Jewish gangsters like Red Levine and Bo Weinberg were apparently used as hitmen by the Luciano faction precisely because they were outsiders, less likely to be suspected.
Clever, using rivals' blind spots.
Right, and then you had these big meetings like the one at the Franconia Hotel in New York in 1931. Key Jewish mobsters sitting down with the top Italian guys, cementing the alliances, figuring out territories and rackets. It was becoming truly organized.
So, okay, they're organized, they're cooperating.
Yeah.
What exactly were they doing? What kind of criminal activities are we talking about?
Oh, it was broad, really broad. You had the obvious stuff like murder, racketeering, the bootlegging we mentioned, but also prostitution, dealing narcotics, smuggling goods, money laundering. They even got into things like, believe it or not, accounting for illegal enterprises, diamond trafficking, weapons, even human trafficking sometimes. Yeah. Plus the classics: extortion, loan sharking, running illegal gambling operations. It was a full-service criminal enterprise.
And they even got involved in the labor movement. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it makes sense if you think about control. They infiltrated and exerted huge influence, often through violence and corruption, in unions like the garment workers, truckers, even the poultry industry in New York. Control the union, you control the industry, skim profits, extort businesses.
Right, control the flow of goods or labor.
Okay.
And what kind of impact did all this have, socially, especially within the Jewish community itself?
Well, it was definitely a double-edged sword, and mostly negative for the community. The existence of these high-profile Jewish gangsters, it fueled anti-Semitism, gave ammunition to people who already hated Jews or wanted to restrict immigration.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Look at these criminals, etc.
Exactly. And inside the Jewish community itself, there was, understandably, a lot of shame and anxiety. They wanted nothing to do with these guys, wanted to distance themselves. It was a source of real concern.
And they had actual turf, right? Like specific areas they controlled.
Oh, yeah. In New York, places like the Lower East Side, Brownsville, and Brooklyn were known strongholds, but they had a significant presence in pretty much every major city with a large Jewish population. And some figures really dominated their cities, like Kid Can in Minneapolis. He ran things there for decades.
It's interesting, though. You mentioned Kid Can running things for decades, but overall, the sources suggest this period of major Jewish American dominance didn't last indefinitely, unlike, say, the Italian mafia families. Why is that?
That's a really key point. It fits into this broader pattern that sociologists call ethnic succession in American crime.
Ethnic succession.
Yeah, think of it like waves. Different immigrant groups arrive, often facing poverty and blocked opportunities in legitimate society. For some, organized crime becomes a path, maybe the only visible path, to money and power. The Irish had their time, then Jewish and Italian groups rose, particularly during Prohibition. But as these groups assimilated more, moved up economically, got educated, found more legitimate paths over generations, Their involvement in street-level and organized crime tended to decrease.
So as opportunities opened up in regular society, the lure of the underworld faded for subsequent generations.
Largely, yes. They moved into business, professions. Their kids weren't inheriting the rackets in the same way you saw with some Italian families. It wasn't always a neat transition, of course. Sometimes Jewish groups were actually working under or alongside established Irish networks earlier on. It was complex.
The source material also mentioned something about how they were portrayed later in literature, maybe, like this idea of them being seen as tougher figures after World War II.
Right. There was a period, especially post-WWII, where some Jewish American writers started exploring figures like gangsters and boxers, almost as a counter-narrative to stereotypes of Jews as being, passive or purely intellectual, kind of reclaiming a sense of toughness.
Interesting, a kind of romanticization.
Maybe a little. But Rich Cohen, who wrote about this, also points out, and it's crucial, we can't forget, these were actual criminals. They exploited people, often within their own community. They weren't heroes.
Right.
And the Yiddish press at the time, they weren't romanticizing anything. They were condemning these guys forcefully.
So unlike the five families of the Italian mafia, we don't really see lasting Jewish crime dynasties.
Exactly. That's a major difference. Lansky, Schultz, Siegel, incredibly powerful figures in their day, but they didn't establish crime families that lasted generations in the same structured way. Their decline after WWII fits that ethnic succession model, while the Italian-American groups, for various complex reasons, maintained a stronger, more enduring structure for longer.
The story doesn't completely end there, does it? The sources talk about a sort of resurgence or maybe new forms appearing later.
That's right. It's not like it vanished entirely. In the late 20th century, and even up to the present, you see new forms emerging. Groups with ties to Orthodox Jewish communities, Israeli organized crime figures operating in the U.S., and especially Jewish Russian mafia groups.
Ah, the Russian connected, like in Brighton Beach.
Exactly. Brighton Beach in Brooklyn became a hub. Figures like Murat Balogula, Boris Neifeld, Evsei Agron. These were Soviet Jewish immigrants, often highly educated, but involved in sophisticated crime rings. Their background was very different from the Lansky and Siegel generation. Different culture, different methods sometimes.
And then there was that really disturbing case involving Orthodox communities and divorce coercion.
Yes, that was a particularly ugly chapter. Started in the 90s, went on until about 2013. A group of mostly Orthodox Jewish men were basically kidnapping and sometimes torturing other Orthodox men.
Torturing them, why?
To force them to grant their wives get a religious divorce according to Jewish law. Without it, the wives couldn't remarry within the faith. This gang turned it into a criminal enterprise, charging huge fees for these forced divorces.
That's horrifying. Like vigilantes for hire, but criminal.
Extremely criminal. The FBI eventually ran a sting operation, brought them down. Leaders like Rabbi Mendel Epstein got significant prison sentences. But sadly, the problem hasn't entirely disappeared. There was another case in 2016, an alleged murder plot tied to this same Orthodox divorce underworld.
Just awful. And what about links to Israel itself? That seems like another complex layer.
Very complex. On one hand, you had some of the earlier generation of American mobsters maybe feeling some ethnic solidarity or wanting good PR, sending money, sometimes illegally obtained, to support the new state of Israel after 1948.
Okay, so some support.
But on the other hand, Israel's law of return, which grants Jews worldwide the right to immigrate, became a potential loophole. Some American mobsters tried to use it to flee prosecution or deportation from the U.S.
Did it work?
Not always. Meyer Lansky famously tried to retire to Israel in the early 70s, but Golda Meir's government, under pressure from the U.S. and not wanting Israel to become a haven for criminals, refused him residency and deported him back to the States.
Interesting. So Israel actively pushed back against becoming a refuge.
They did. And the issue hasn't gone away. Our sources mention a 2010 WikiLeaks cable showing the U.S. Embassy in Israel was worried about Israeli organized crime figures, their connections to the U.S., and were trying to get visa restrictions put on known criminals.
And Israeli crime groups themselves operating internationally.
Yes. There's documented involvement of Israeli mafia families, like the Abergil crime family mentioned in the source, in things like trafficking large amounts of ecstasy into the United States. So the connections remain, but they've evolved.
It really is this constantly shifting picture, isn't it? And we look through the list of notable members mentioned in our source material. It's quite a lineup, spanning decades in different kinds of crime.
Absolutely. You go from those early street guys like Monk Eastman and Gyp the Blood, through the Prohibition titans like Rothstein, Lansky, Siegel, Dutch Schultz. then the labor racketeers, and right up to the more recent figures involved in Russian, Israeli, or even those religious extortion rings. It's a very wide net.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what are the main things you think we should really take away from all this?
Okay, well, first, I think it's just recognizing that Jewish American organized crime was, a genuine and really significant force in the American underworld for a long time, especially that first half of the 20th century. Can't ignore it.
Right. It wasn't a footnote.
Definitely not. Second, its story is totally tangled up with other ethnic crime groups, especially the Italian Americans. That shift from rivalry to close cooperation is key.
The syndicate era.
Exactly. Third, the range of their criminal activities was huge, and the impact, often negative, particularly the way it fueled anti-Semitism, was real.
Got it.
And finally, while that sort of classic era of the Jewish mobster largely faded with assimilation, we see how organized crime can, well, reappear in new forms, connected to newer immigrant communities or different circumstances like the Russian and Israeli groups, or even those specific Orthodox community issues.
It's a history that, yeah, like you said at the start, might be uncomfortable, maybe even painful for some, but it definitely gives us real insights into those big themes: immigration, assimilation, poverty, and how crime weaves through American society.
Absolutely. It's part of the American story, warts and all.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. Thinking about these cycles, immigration waves, the persistent lure of organized crime, what new shapes might ethnic-based crime take in the future?
Yeah, and what lessons can we actually draw from this history we've just explored? How does understanding the rise and fall and transformation of Jewish American organized crime help us understand what might be happening now or next? Definitely something to think about.